so I was asked to talk about the role of macronutrients and ultra-processed food in energy homeostasis. And what I wanted to start with was talking a little bit about at least one viewpoint about a cause for obesity and some research that we've done and others have done to test that mechanism. And so the mechanism is something called the carbohydrate-insulin model of obesity, which basically takes the view that if you want to understand how people have excess body fat, it's helpful to understand how fat cells regulate body fat, fat storage. And indeed, we know quite a lot about the biochemistry of that process. And we know that insulin is a hormone that is very important in regulating how much fat is stored inside fat cells. Insulin inhibits the release of the breakdown and release of fat from fat cells. And it also stimulates the uptake of fat from the circulation and storage in fat cells. And so one of the things that we also know about insulin, in addition to these effects on the biochemistry and storage and release of fat from fat cells, is that insulin secretion is in general stimulated by carbohydrates in the diet. And so the story of the carbohydrate insulin model is that people who are eating a high carbohydrate diet tend to have higher levels of insulin secretion, which will tend to promote fat storage inside fat cells. And as a result of diverting that energy to fat cells, you will have a corresponding decrease in circulating metabolic fuels, such as the free fatty acids in the circulation, glucose levels. And that low level of circulating fuels is sensed by the brain somehow and tells your brain that you should be hungrier and eat more calories and also perhaps suppress energy expenditure. And so the interesting part of this carbohydrate insulin model of obesity is that the direction of causality moves from the right-hand side, this anabolic adipose tissue or fat tissue in the body, causing via decreased circulating fuels the body to be have increased hunger and lower number of calories burned. That's opposite in the direction that many people have normally thought about obesity, which is that for some reason people consume an excess of calories and have a decrease in their number of calories that they're expending, and that energy imbalance then drives stored fat tissue and stored fat in fat tissue of the body. So in other words, a direction from left to the right on this diagram. So the description of the carbohydrate insulin model, according to David Ludwig, who is the leading proponent of this model, is that a high carbohydrate diet produces postprandial hyperinsulinemia, that's elevated levels of insulin after meals. And that promotes deposition of calories in fat cells instead of oxidation in lean tissues, and thereby predisposes to weight gain through increased hunger, slowing metabolic rate, or both. So that's a very interesting model of how obesity may have developed. And it also suggests a certain solution, right? Which is if you decrease carbohydrates in the diet and decrease insulin, then you could reverse this causal pathway and enable you to eat fewer calories because you're less hungry, and also perhaps increase your energy expenditure. So this is again an interesting model, a little bit differently than the way people have classically thought of obesity. And one of the nice things about any sort of scientific model is that you can design experimental tests of the model. And so we recently designed a test of this model where we compared two diets that had very different carbohydrate levels, and it resulted in very different insulin secretion. I'll show you that, and that has some predictable effects on, for example, energy intake and energy expenditure. So let me share the design of this study. So what we did was we brought in 20 men and women with obesity. None had diabetes. That's an important caveat to know about. And because we were really interested in measuring how much they chose to eat, we had to house them on our metabolic ward for 28 continuous days, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, where we could control their food environment very precisely. They wouldn't have access to off-study foods, and we could measure every morsel of food that they ate over each 28-day period. And in one case, we randomize people to receive, for example, the first diet would be 10% carbohydrate, 75% fat, and 15% protein. And then they were switched at the end of the first 2 weeks to a 10% fat, 75% carbohydrate diet. So some people were randomized to that diet order, and the other half were randomized to the reverse diet order in the bottom. When we measured a lot of things on these folks, but the primary outcome, which they were not aware of, was that we were measuring how much they were actually eating. What the participants were informed of was that we're interested in just seeing how these diets affect your body. We're going to measure a lot of things. This is not a weight loss study. Please don't be trying to gain or lose weight over the course of the study. We're just trying to test the metabolic effects of these different diets. So what were these diets in particular? Well, one thing to note is that they both had the same base of non-starchy vegetables. And then in one case, for the low-carb diet, we added a bunch of animal-based products to make up the majority of the calories. So more than 80% of calories came from animal-based products. On the left-hand side is a breakfast from one of our 7-day rotating menus. This is sort of a cheesy veggie scramble with eggs and cheese and broccoli. In the middle is a steak salad for lunch, and on the right is a zucchini noodle pasta with some beef sauce and a side salad. Again, 80% of the calories coming from animal-based products, a common foundation of non-starchy vegetables, and 10% carb, 75% fat, 15% protein diet. On the other diet was entirely plant-based. So it was a vegan diet. And in this case, again, same base of non-starchy vegetables, but high glycemic index foods like quinoa, blueberry cereal on the left-hand side, and in the middle, a black bean stir fry, and on the right, a spaghetti and marinara sauce. Again, and this diet is now 10% fat, 75% carbohydrate, and 15% protein. And so by design, these two diets lead to very different insulin secretion rates and very different glucose excursion. So here's some meal tests on these two diets. On the top, you can see that the low-fat diet leads to a much greater glucose excursion after the meals compared to the low-carb diet in red, and more than threefold greater area under the insulin curve on the bottom panel compared to the low-carb diet. In fact, when we measured 24-hour urinary C-peptide, which is a molecule that's co-secreted with insulin on a one-to-one basis, but unlike insulin, which is cleared by a variety of tissues in the body, C-peptide is only cleared in the urine, and therefore by measuring the amount of C-peptide that's excreted in the urine daily, we can get an accurate measure of daily insulin secretion. And so what you can see here is that during the low-fat diet, people were experiencing 60% higher daily insulin secretion than compared with the low carb diet. So very, very big differences in insulin secretion. And so therefore, according to the carbohydrate-insulin model, the people, when they are on the low carb diet, because they have lower insulin, should release the fat from their fat cells, alleviate that low level of circulating metabolic fuels, and that should decrease their hunger. In addition, because the amount of carbohydrate in the diet is actually very low, we also saw quite marked elevations of ketones in the blood. Here's the time course of capillary beta hydroxybutyrate over the course of the 2 weeks on each diet. You can see that especially by the second week, people are clearly ketogenic on the low carb diet. And the ketones per se are also thought to suppress appetite. So again, if the carbohydrate insulin model is correct, the low levels of insulin and especially the high levels of ketones should cause these folks to eat many fewer calories because of their decreased hunger. Unfortunately, we saw exactly the opposite effect. people ate substantially less calories on the low-fat diet as compared to the low-carb diet, almost 600 calories per day lower on the low-fat diet. Now, these are the same individuals experiencing both diets in random order. And in fact, every single individual ate fewer calories on the low-fat diet as compared to the low-carb diet. So this definitely goes against the carbohydrate insulin model predictions. Again, it may have reversed if we'd waited longer, but at least over a 2-week period, we clearly saw the exact opposite effect than that would be predicted based on the carbohydrate insulin model. Now, despite eating 700 calories per day more during the low carb diet as compared to the low fat diet, people didn't report any differences in hunger, satisfaction, fullness, or eating capacity between the two diets. And this was measured over several days on both diets. And they also did not report liking one diet more in terms of their pleasantness of the meals or being more familiar with some foods in one diet versus another. And the familiarity ratings are not too surprising because we excluded people who couldn't correctly identify more than 75% of the foods in the diet. What we didn't want to have happen was to recruit people who would have some sort of neophobia to the foods and therefore eat very, very few calories especially on one diet as compared to another. Okay. So not surprisingly, when you are eating 700 calories per day less, you tend to lose body fat on one diet as compared to the other. So only the low-fat diet led to a significant reduction in body fat in our subjects over the 2 weeks as measured by DEXA. But interestingly, the low-carb diet led to quite substantial reductions in fat-free mass. Now, this is everything other than body fat mass. So this is including all the fluids in your body. So extracellular fluid, intracellular fluid, the stuff that's attached to glycogen, et cetera, et cetera. And indeed, one of the interesting things was that if people didn't have access to a DEXA machine, they might have experienced more rapid weight loss, or they did experience more rapid weight loss on the low carb diet, despite eating 700 calories per day more. Now, again, that didn't get reflected in body fat changes, which is what we would hope would happen with weight loss. But they definitely, if they weren't measuring body fat with a DEXA device, you would experience quite substantial weight loss over 2 weeks on a low carb diet, despite eating more or less what they were eating before, I would gather, because their fat mass was relatively stable. So this, might actually be beneficial in the sense of it might allow people to stick to the diet a little bit more because they get this positive feedback. I'm not eating any less, and yet I'm losing weight on this diet, despite most of that weight loss. In fact, all of that weight loss coming from fat-free mass. Over time, people might end up losing a little bit more body fat if they stick to these kinds of diets and decrease their energy intake over time. So what about the energy expenditure predictions of the carbohydrate insulin model? Again, the idea here would be if you don't allow people to eat differently, keep their calories constant and keep the protein constant, but vary the carbohydrate and fat content of the diet, maybe the low carb diets, instead of causing you to be less hungry, maybe they would actually increase the number of calories that you burn. So we've done a variety of studies addressing that, but so have several other people. And so recently we conducted a systematic review and meta-analysis of all of the controlled human feeding studies that had kept the number of calories constant, but varied the carbohydrate and fat proportion in the diet and also kept protein constant. And what you can see here is that there's a highly statistically significant effect on this forest plot favoring lower fat diets for increased energy expenditure. But this is an example of where statistical significance has absolutely no clinical meaningful benefit. This is a difference, a pooled weighted mean difference of 28 calories per day. So that's like a couple bites of a cookie or something like that. It's an extraordinarily small, I would argue, physiologically and clinically meaningless difference in energy expenditure. And then similarly, when we look at body fat changes, again, highly statistically significant fat loss differences favoring lower fat diets, but again, the effect size is extremely tiny, only 16 grams per day. And so what that tells me is that on the energy expenditure and energy partitioning side of things, you can manipulate carbohydrates and fats by huge amounts and yet have relatively little effect on both the number of calories that are being burned as well as the amount of body fat that's being lost, which is quite remarkable. And then our other study suggests that large differences in carbs and fat do not lead to the expected changes in energy intake as would be predicted based on the carbohydrate insulin model. So, this is not going to end the diet wars in terms of low carbs and low fat diets. They're going to continue, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your point of view. These kinds of studies and debates are very popular to follow. But it kind of has made me think, maybe there's something else about low carb and low fat diets that can explain why so many people have successes on both of these kinds of diets. And it occurs to me that, both diets, the people who promote these kinds of diets tend to say that you should eat a lot of non-starchy vegetables, should try to focus on preparing a lot more meals from scratch, and avoid the sort of things that you can see in this diagram here from a supermarket, where there's a lot of ready to heat, ready to eat sort of foods, something called ultra processed foods. And so this concept of ultra processed food consumption being related to obesity has been demonstrated by several sort of epidemiological type investigations. Here's just an example showing Canadian food purchases over time, showing that ultra processed foods in red have increased in prevalence such that they now make up more than half of calories purchased by Canadians. Culinary ingredients have taken a nosedive, on the other hand, so that people are preparing less and less food at home. And so these are, of course, would be correlated with the increased prevalence of obesity. And indeed, many epidemiological studies have suggested that foods higher in, people who consume diets higher in ultra-processed foods tend to have greater levels of obesity, as well as a variety of other diseases. And one potential means by which that might exert itself as a mechanism is that ultra-processed foods also tend to be high in salt, sugar, and fat, and they tend to be low in fiber. And so when I was first interested in understanding, what could it be about ultra-processed foods that may drive obesity, people started mentioning, those kinds of foods are higher in salt, sugar, and fat, and they're lower in fiber. But those are nutrients, and they're not really necessarily to do with processing, whereas there's a faction of people who say it's actually the processing per se that causes obesity. And so I was interested in probing this mechanism and trying to understand what could this potentially help explain increasing obesity rates. And so we did the first randomized control trial of ultra-processed versus unprocessed diets. And it's a very similar design to the previous study I just showed you, where we randomized 20 men and women without diabetes to stay with us for again a month at a time, and they were either assigned to an ultra processed diet followed by an unprocessed diet, or the reverse. And again, the primary outcome here was to look at how many calories these people chose to eat. Now, here what we decided to do was actually match the diets for calories that were presented: carbs, fat, sugar, sodium, and fiber, so that we wanted to eliminate the effect of ultra-processed foods driving the effect due to those, the high salt, sugar, fat, and low fiber values. So we basically designed two diets that were matched for those nutrients as well as overall macronutrients. And on the left, you can see the 7-day rotating menu and the snacks for the ultra-processed diet. On the right is the 7-day rotating menu for the unprocessed diet. The degree of processing was determined by the NOVA classification system, but you don't really need to know that. If you just look at the images, you can kind of, it's not hard to tell which one is the ultra processed and which one is the unprocessed diets. And so these folks were basically told to eat as much or as little as desired. Again, they were told this is not a weight loss study. We're just interested in how these foods affect them. And so here's the main result here, which was that during the ultra processed diet, of which 80% of calories came from ultra processed foods, people spontaneously overate by 500 calories per day more than during the unprocessed diet, which had 0% of calories from ultra processed foods. They did not report any differences in hunger, fullness, satisfaction, or eating capacity. They didn't report significant differences in pleasantness or familiarity. And in fact, during the ultra processed diet, these folks gained weight, whereas during the unprocessed diet, they lost weight, and the weight gain and weight loss was also reflected by accumulation of body fat or loss of body fat, according to DEXA. So now we're left with this question, and it's been a little bit of a Rorschach test about, what is it about ultra-processed foods that cause people to overeat and gain weight? And I don't have a definitive answer for you. There's a lot of things that were different between the diets. One of them is that the actual foods, when you subtract out the beverages in the ultra-processed diet, were more energy dense compared to the unprocessed diet. I think that that's probably the leading hypothesis right now, but there's a whole variety of other things that are different between the diets. And so we're working on follow-up studies to address those mechanisms. So with that, I'd just like to thank the folks who do most of the work for these studies, and I'll end there. I'm looking forward to the discussion later.